They were called parents, but what they raised were offerings. 14 children with no past, no papers, no freedom, and no way out. What you're about to hear is not just a story, it's a fracture in the illusion of safety. A tale so precisely buried in legal fog, church whispers, and institutional silence that pulling on any single thread might unravel the entire tapestry of what you call normal life. This is the story of the Follings, not a family, not really, something else, a machine, a ritual, a containment vessel dressed in lace and money. Howard and Margaret Folling arrived in Milbrook, Pennsylvania in 1978. They bought a mansion that no one wanted, an abandoned Victorian on Elm Street that children whispered about and adults avoided. It had sat dormant for nearly a decade, vines growing like veins across its rotting skin. But Howard saw promise. Margaret saw sanctuary. Together, they saw purpose. He was a financier from Pittsburgh. Private money, quiet money, the kind that appears when records disappear. She was a former pediatric nurse trained in trauma units and psychiatric facilities. An expert, they said, a caregiver. But when you see the pattern, what happened to the children, they weren't being cared for. They were being shaped. Their first adopted child, James, came in 1980. The town cheered, a barren couple opening their home to a forgotten child. How noble, how godly. But no one asked where James came from. No one saw the missing birth certificate. No one noticed the way Margaret flinched when anyone asked to hold him. They called it motherly instinct. By 1985, there were 5 children in the home. None had documentation. None attended school. Margaret homeschooled them, she said, but homeschooling doesn't mean vanishing. And these children, James, Elizabeth, Thomas, Catherine, William, they weren't just unseen, they were untraceable. The House, once dark and lifeless, now held light in every window, but never the kind that spills onto porches. It was sterile light, surveillance light, a kind that feels more like an operating room than a home. And yet the town adored them, called them blessed. God has smiled on that house, said one neighbor. But I ask you, what kind of God demands children without names? What kind of family needs the past scrubbed clean? We begin here, with a house that should have stayed empty, and the first child who never cried. Children are born with a name, a cry, a tether to the world. Strip them of that, and what you have left is not a child. It's a vessel. By the summer of 1985, 5 such vessels moved through the hallways of the Folling estate. Not one had ever enrolled in school. Not one had ever been taken to a pediatrician in town. Not one had ever appeared in a yearbook, a field trip photo, a public record of any kind. And still, no one asked questions. Why? Because the town of Milbrook, like so many others, worshipped image more than truth. The Follings played their roles perfectly. Church every Sunday, donations to the fire department, hand-stitched Christmas stockings mailed anonymously to needy families. The illusion was complete. But inside that house, something else was unfolding. Neighbors began to notice, not what the children did, but what they didn't. They didn't laugh, didn't run, didn't play. When seen outside, they walked in single file. Perfect posture, perfect silence, as if rehearsed, as if choreographed. One child, James, the first, would sometimes glance at passing cars with a look that wasn't curiosity. It was calculation. This is what happens when identity is interrupted, when names are reassigned, when a child is not given a future, but taught to forget the past. The Follings weren't raising a family, they were scrubbing a slate. And Margaret, she had a system. Neighbors called it strict. But strict doesn't explain the metronomic timing of lights turning off, meals being served, garden walks at exactly 6:05 p.m. every Thursday. She kept binders, color-coded, with initials and symbols, not names. She logged behaviors, food intake, sleep cycles, even blink patterns during prayer. Some said it was obsessive. I say it was programming. And Howard, he wasn't just a financier, he was connected. Names tied to him led to offshore adoption networks, private or P. Hanages, and shell charities that existed for barely a fiscal quarter, always in states where oversight was weakest, always dealing in hard-to-place children, code for undocumented, traumatized, disposable, the perfect raw material. You see, these weren't just adoptions. These were extractions, children removed from their timelines, their languages, their names, children reassembled into something else. Something Margaret called clean. But trauma doesn't erase itself, it roots, it festers. And one day, it reveals itself in a cracked stare, in a broken silence, in a boy who falls from a tree and doesn't cry when his arm shatters through skin. That's when the mask began to slip. Pain is the body's alarm system. When it goes silent, something has been severed, not just nerves, but will. When 9-year-old Thomas Folling fell from the oak tree behind the house in the summer of 1987, the community barely blinked. Accidents happen, but the silence that followed was deafening. Margaret, with her medical background, didn't take him to the hospital. She set the bone herself. It snapped again, infected, swollen, rotting. Thomas drifted into fevered stillness, and only then did Howard bring him to Milbrook General. The boy was in septic shock. Emergency surgery was the only option. The attending physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, had seen child abuse cases before, but this was different. Thomas didn't cry, not during the exam, not during the IV, not when they prepped him for the knife. He stared, unblinking, as though waiting for a signal to react. When she asked how it happened, he looked to his father before answering. That's when Dr. Chen knew, not just that something was wrong, but that something was systematic. She asked for medical records. There were none. Howard said they'd been destroyed in a fire. She asked for birth certificates. He changed the subject, and when she pressed, he grew agitated, threatened to have her transferred. He could do it too. His foundation funded half the hospital's pediatric wing. But Sarah filed the report anyway. A caseworker came. David Morris, young, new. He visited the Folling home, was welcomed with cookies and a curated tour. The children stood like statues, polite, smiling, memorized answers, no signs of trauma, no bruises. He closed the case in under a month. To the state, it was over. But something had begun to unravel. Dr. Chen told a colleague later, "It wasn't just what I saw, it was what I didn't. There were no drawings on the fridge, no toys, no mess. It didn't feel like children lived there. It felt like they were being preserved. And in many ways, they were. Like artifacts, like relics of something ancient and sacred to the Follings, but not human." Thomas survived, but from that day forward, his face held a subtle asymmetry. His arm healed, but his speech slowed. Some say it was nerve damage. Others say something inside him cracked, not the bone, the program. And once a crack appears in a system like that, the whole architecture starts to tremble. Cracks don't scream, they whisper, quiet hairline fractures that stretch beneath the surface until the foundation gives way. After Thomas's injury, the house on Elm Street changed. Neighbors couldn't explain it, but they felt it. The lights stayed on longer. Curtains never opened during the day. The garden, once immaculately trimmed by Margaret herself, grew wild, like something had been forgotten or abandoned. But Margaret didn't abandon anything. She doubled down. Within the next 3 years, the Follings adopted 3 more children, Robert, Anne, and Henry. Each arrived without fanfare, no baby showers, no church blessings, just appeared. And always the same pattern followed. No documentation, no doctors, no school. The adoption agencies they used, gone, shuttered, investigated for fraud. Some didn't exist at all, offices with disconnected numbers and fake names. Yet no charges were ever brought against the Follings. Why? Because Howard knew how to insulate. He worked through foundations, trust funds, blind LLCs, shadows wearing legal clothing. He'd established a persona, the savior of lost children, and no one dared question the benevolent man writing checks to local orphanages, libraries, and churches. That's how power hides, not behind force, behind generosity. But behind closed doors, the atmosphere grew heavier. Witnesses reported that none of the Folling children looked older than 14, despite the family having adopted their first child over a decade earlier. It wasn't just improbable, it was impossible. Were the children being replaced, recycled, or was time itself being manipulated through psychological arrest, where trauma loops development into a suspended state? Ask any expert in psychological control. If you isolate a child, erase their history, remove variation from their day-to-day, you can stop their personality from forming. You can create a blank, and from that blank you can build anything. That's what Margaret specialized in. Her journals, later discovered locked in a trunk behind the third-floor wall, contained chilling entries, not motherly reflections, but logs, observations, metrics. J responds better to 20-minute prayer immersion than E. C flinched at mirror test, reassess exposure level, exhibited shame after delayed meal, effective, not children, subjects. And then came the Thursday incident. A neighbor walking her dog heard what she swore was chanting from the attic window, rhythmic, repetitive, low. When she mentioned it at the church social, Margaret smiled and said it was part of their spiritual routine. But the neighbor never heard children laugh again, only murmur, only footsteps, perfectly in sync. There's a flaw in every old house that was never meant to be found, not because it's forgotten, but because it remembers too much. The third floor of the Folling estate had no staircase visible from the main halls, just a narrow, creaking set of servant steps tucked behind a locked pantry door. It wasn't marked on the original blueprints, yet it spanned the length of the house. The townspeople believed it was just storage, attic crawl space, maybe a guest room no longer used. But Susan Fletcher knew better. Susan was a social worker and she'd seen the signs, children who flinched before speaking, the synchronized glances toward their mother before answering even the simplest questions. And then there was the girl in the window, dark-haired, pale, silent, a face Susan had never seen before. She'd been invited for tea that afternoon, a rare opening into the Follings' inner world. Margaret was cordial, elegant as always, but behind her charm was a tension Susan had learned to recognize, performance masking control. At one point, Margaret stepped away to take a call, and Susan, alone in the hall, heard something. A low rustle, then a thud, then a child's voice, not crying, repeating, over and over. It came from above. Susan moved to the stairwell behind the pantry and tried the door, locked, but what she saw then froze her blood. Just above the keyhole, carved deep into the wood, was a symbol, not a letter, not decorative, a sigil. 3 concentric circles intersected by a vertical line with a single dot at the center. Later, Susan would learn that symbol matched one used in declassified psychological conditioning programs from the 1950s. Not programs designed to heal minds, programs designed to break them. The journals found years later referenced the third floor only in code. Chamber B. No photos, no schematics, only entries like B rotation, Peter, and Paul, 37 minutes, mirror alignment confirmed. Subject Mary, exceeded silence threshold, begin shadow protocol. Light exposure at 18% caused vertigo in subject H, adjust accordingly. These weren't rituals of punishment, they were rituals of control. The children weren't being hidden up there. They were being altered, rewritten through isolation, obedience, and repetition. Words repeated until language dissolved, memories replaced with daily truths. Some sessions lasted hours, some days, and yet no one reported missing children, because these children had never existed, on paper. But they existed in that house, on the third floor, and something else existed with them. The journals were bound in black leather, untitled, unlabeled. No authorship, yet unmistakably Margaret's handwriting, precise, neat, with a clinical detachment that made the content even more horrifying. They were discovered during the property's final search, hidden behind a false wall in the third-floor linen closet, not by police, not by investigators, but by Emily Fletcher. She was just 17 when her mother disappeared. Susan Fletcher had grown too curious, too insistent. She had requested case reviews, filed quiet reports, pushed for further home visits. Margaret, always cordial, stopped inviting her for tea, stopped answering calls, and then, one Tuesday morning, Susan walked out of her house with a folder of notes, and was never seen again. No body, no trace, no witnesses, just a phone call that never connected, and a daughter who never stopped looking. Years later, after the Folling estate was finally condemned, Emily returned. She walked through the rotting halls, floorboards soft with moisture and time. The wallpaper on the third floor had peeled to reveal not plaster, but more symbols, sigils like the one carved above the pantry, not random, but placed with terrifying precision. And then she found the trunk. Inside, 6 journals, each dated, each covering 1 year, but what they contained wasn't a log of memories, it was a manual. There were no family anecdotes, no milestones, no warmth, just entries with timestamps, child initials, strange phrases like delta phase induced via echo chamber, subject J compliant for 11min4043 secern, submersion protocol tested on A, oxygen control necessary, eye dilation test successful, response to strobe predictably null, initiated the silence doctrine, 72 hours complete, results consistent with Project Fallow. Project Fallow. Emily had never heard of it, but later in classified files released to. Through a FOIA request her father had filed years prior, she found it again. A Cold War-era black program meant to train children for deep state disassociation and memory isolation. It was shut down in 1974. Or so they said. And here it was, reborn in a Victorian house in Milbrook, in the hands of a wealthy financier and a pediatric nurse. Margaret wasn't experimenting, she was replicating. The rituals in the third floor weren't madness, they were engineered, timed, calibrated, down to the second, and if that's true, the question isn't, how did they do this? It's who gave them the blueprint. Every year on the second Sunday of May, Mother's Day, a black car pulled up to the Folling estate, no license plate, no local driver, always the same, tinted windows, unmarked tires, a hum that didn't belong in a town like Milbrook. The car never stayed long, sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes less, but it always came, rain or shine. Churchgoers noticed, children stared, but no one ever saw the driver, no one ever knocked. The car arrived, and Margaret would meet it at the end of the driveway. She always wore white, not the lace and pearls of a town matriarch, but white like a technician's uniform, immaculate, crisp, sterile. One neighbor, an old man named Harris who lived across the street, claimed once, when walking his dog at dawn, he saw her hand something into the car, a briefcase, black, heavy. Then she stood at attention, military style, until the window slid up, and the car vanished down the road, wheels never touching the potholes that rattled every other vehicle in town. He told his son, but was dismissed as paranoid. But that same week, Margaret logged something new in her journal. Mother's Day transfer successful, new set received, encryption confirmed, case S14 initiated. Encryption, case S14, transfer. This wasn't maternal, it was transactional. The black car wasn't a visitor, it was a courier, and Margaret wasn't a mother. She was a custodian. You see, control programs don't just disappear when headlines fade, they go underground. They find new faces, new names, new missions. In the Cold War they called them assets, not people, not citizens, just tools, malleable and loyal. And what better way to build a tool than from childhood? No past, no papers, no resistance. Milbrook wasn't a mistake. It was camouflage. A pastoral lie wrapped around an operational center disguised as a home. And that car? It was connected to a foundation room. Registered in Delaware, the address traced to a shell building rented by a firm that shared clients with several private military contractors, the same firms that had been quietly audited in the 80s for experimental personnel optimization research. Margaret Folling wasn't operating alone, she was receiving instructions. And every Mother's Day she sent something back. A report, a subject, a result. The town never knew, but the children knew. One of them tried to escape in 1995. He didn't make it past the garden. They called him William. But that wasn't his name. He was the sixth child adopted by the Follings, and the only one who ever tried to break the cycle. The others obeyed, watched, waited. William remembered. That was his flaw. He remembered a woman who sang to him in another language. He remembered a tattoo on a man's forearm, a basement with peeling paint, a door that locked from the outside. He wasn't supposed to retain that. According to Margaret's journal, William had failed full disassociation. But Margaret didn't discard failures. She retrained them. Subject W retains sensory trace of former identity. Initiate Chamber B reprogramming. 12-day silence immersion. No contact. William was locked in the third floor for nearly 2 weeks. No light, no sound, only the ticking of a metronome and the looped voice of Margaret on tape. You are not who you were. You are who we say. He emerged, blank, like the others, until spring of 1995. That's when he ran. It happened at night, after thunder had knocked out the power. Cameras failed. The alarm system glitched. William slipped through the back door, barefoot, bleeding from the soles. He crossed 2 properties before reaching the old railroad tracks. And then, something stopped him. No one saw what happened, but early the next morning, a local boy named Caleb, riding his bike along the trail, found him curled under a tree, naked, shaking, lips moving, but no sound. His vocal cords had been severed. At the hospital, doctors couldn't explain it. No bruising, no signs of a fight. It was as though the tissue had been cut from the inside. Dr. Chen, yes, that Dr. Chen, was still practicing. She pushed for a deeper investigation, but within 48 hours the hospital was visited by 2 men in charcoal suits. No badges, no names. They spoke with administration, and just like that, William was discharged into Folling custody. He never ran again. He never spoke again. But 6 months later, messages began appearing in chalk beneath the Milbrook bridge. Cryptic, always the same sequence. S14 failed. Eyes behind walls. You are not who you were. Town workers erased them, but they returned, over and over, like the voice of someone buried alive, screaming in symbols no one else could hear. William didn't escape, but his memory did, and now it had started leaking. It had. Beneath the house, beneath even the foundation stones laid in 1882, was a chamber that did not appear on any blueprint, not in the county archives, not in construction records, not even in the original deed held in Pittsburgh's historic register. It was known only by one word, never spoken aloud, only written once on the inside cover of Margaret's final journal, Substratum. The chamber wasn't discovered until 2004, years after the Follings vanished, not by accident and not by search warrant, but by demolition. The estate was slated to be torn down after a string of mysterious fires. The workers were warned of unstable beams, mold, asbestos. What they found instead was stone, ancient hand-carved bone-white limestone, not local, etched with markings older than any language Pennsylvania had ever known. Runes, symbols, some resembling Sumerian cuneiform, others closer to Proto-Hebrew, mixed with something else, something that didn't belong in human chronology. A steel hatch was embedded in the center of the stone floor, triple-locked, with a pressure-sealed dial, welded shut from within. And someone had opened it. Inside, one room, no furniture, no ventilation, no light fixtures, only mirrors. 22 of them, bolted to every wall, ceiling, and floor panel, none reflecting each other, each one set at odd, disorienting angles, as if their purpose was not to see, but to fracture. And at the room's center, a circular iron frame, child-sized, surrounded by clamps. Blood was found, dried thick in concentric rings around the base. DNA testing was inconclusive, corrupted, unreadable, as if the samples themselves resisted identification. But there was something else, etched into the mirrors, barely visible beneath layers of oxidized silver. S14, Chamber 0, unmaking the self. This wasn't conditioning, it was erasure. A place to destroy memory, not with chemicals, not with torture, but with reflection. The kind that bends inward so far it snaps. Margaret once wrote, "To control a child, shape their fears. To command their soul, remove their origin." The substratum was origin removal, the final ritual, and in its walls, some say, screams still echo, not through sound but thought, a kind of imprinting. Those who've entered the room report dizziness, nausea, and dreams that aren't theirs, dreams of floating, dreams of falling, dreams of becoming someone else. There's no record of how many children entered the substratum, only this chilling phrase carved into the inner hatch. You are who we say. It was never just the Follings. They were agents, caretakers, conduits for something far older, something that required no titles, no attention, and no face. In the margins of Journal 6, amid lists of subjects, reflections, and resistance grades, the name appears only once. Not scrawled in panic, etched in reverence. The benefactor. No first name, no origin, just a presence, always watching, always sending. The term didn't originate with Margaret. She inherited it. Her notes reference protocol continuance, legacy systems, and historical debt owed to the benefactor. In one haunting entry dated November 3, 1994, she writes, "Received new litany today, delivered in cipher via the courier, refracted through the mirror at 3:11 a.m., voice not human, confirmed alignment, children responded without command." That night, all the lights in the Folling estate burned for exactly 7 minutes and then blacked out simultaneously. The town thought it was a surge, but those who lived closest, like the elderly Harris, swore they saw shadows on the roof, shifting in patterns, not cast by anything visible. So who, or what, was the benefactor? One theory traces the name to an obscure, heavily redacted project within the CIA's Stargate program, known only as Vorax, a mind-fracturing initiative supposedly abandoned in the 70s, but in a footnote of a declassified document, Vorax is said to be, under new stewardship, legacy transference arranged through benefactor trust, a legal entity, with funding. Emily Fletcher, years later, tracked financial flows connected to the Follings. She found offshore accounts tied to a shell foundation called the Belgrave Initiative. Its records, sealed under national security exemptions. But two payments stood out. $88,000 on December 12, 1989, marked curriculum renewal, and $42,000 on April 23, 1993, marked simply mirror work. Each transfer followed the adoption of a new child. The benefactor wasn't just funding them, he was grading them, feeding them new rituals, new phrases, new instruments of control, like the litany of fracture mentioned in at least 4 journal entries, a phrase whispered to children just before substratum immersion: let the self break, let the name die, let the silence speak. It was Margaret's gospel, but not her creation. She was following a blueprint passed down through decades, possibly centuries. From orphanages in Eastern Europe to boarding schools in the Alps to psychiatric wards in Illinois that burned under mysterious circumstances. All of them had one thing in common: children with no past. Children made, not born. It begins in fire. In the winter of 1881, deep in the Carpathian Mountains, a Benedictine monastery burned to the ground. Officially, it was blamed on a lightning strike. Unofficially, the fire consumed more than buildings. It erased names, histories, and an entire generation of orphaned boys. Only one child was found alive. No burns, no injuries, no soot, just standing barefoot in the snow, wrapped in a white sheet embroidered with symbols not seen since pre-Christian Mesopotamia. His eyes, black, not from pigment, but from something deeper, something ancient. The monks had called him Nicodemus. But to the outside world, he had no surname, no origin, no papers. He was handed over to an aristocratic family in Vienna, wealthy patrons of the monastery who were known to fund esoteric studies. The boy was reportedly mute, emotionless, brilliant. Within 2 years, he vanished again. But whispers began. He was spotted in Geneva, seated silently beside a philosopher who would later go mad. Then again in 1903 in Boston, outside the Harvard Psychological Laboratory. Unaged, unchanged. A man with the face of a child. The same face. Declassified OSS memos from World War II describe a non-aging observer present during early MK research, codenamed BNF, which many now believe stood for Benefactor Nicodemus Figure. One chilling quote from a 1945 memo reads, "Subject BNF spoke once, erase the root and the tree forgets how to grow." All present reported feeling hollow afterward. 2 committed suicide within 48 hours. This wasn't myth. It was observation. And it matches a pattern. Every 50 to 70 years, a new identity, a new appearance, but the same eyes, the same silence, the same agenda. And always near children. Children who disappeared, children who reappeared under new names, children who spoke languages they'd never learned, drew maps of places they'd never been, wept when shown mirrors. Nicodemus was not a man. He was a template, a living archetype of unpersoned control. Emily found his image twice. Once in a photograph from 1921 in a French orphanage funded by a group later connected to early NATO intelligence. The other, in the background of a Folling family portrait from 1986. A guest, never identified, standing between the twins, Paul and Peter, his hand resting on both their shoulders, smiling. The Follings weren't his inventors. They were his disciples. The mirror has always been a lie. To most, it reflects. To a few, it splits. Ancient Babylonian priests believed that the soul could be divided, not broken but cleaved, through ritual exposure to reflective surfaces under controlled incantation. In the recovered fragments of the Ketef Shemesh tablets, there is a phrase repeated 9 times. To see the self is to lose the name. The face is a gate. These rites were reserved not for royalty or worshippers, but for prisoners, those sentenced not to death, but erasure. Their memories were stripped, their identities unraveled, not by pain, but by mirrored silence. Now fast forward 3,000 years. In 1952, a little-known division within the Tavistock Institute began funding mirror exposure therapy experiments on children diagnosed with early identity dissociation. This was not mainstream psychology. It was black protocol. Children were placed in isolation rooms with angled mirrors, no voices, no touch, only flickering lights and white noise. After 72 hours, many couldn't say their names. Some stared at their own reflections and screamed, not in terror, but in recognition. As if they saw something in the mirror they weren't meant to. This process became the blueprint for what Margaret Folling later referred to as the mirror doctrine. In Journal 8, she writes, "The mirror does not lie. It fractures. Once the child forgets its face, it becomes open. The benefactor may then install. Install, not teach, not raise. Install, like software." This was how the Follings operated, not as parents, but as technicians. The children weren't nurtured, they were programmed. The mirror wasn't a vanity piece in the Folling home, it was an altar. The substratum chamber was its temple. And the litany Margaret chanted before each ritual was derived from a bastardized version of the Babylonian soul-cleaving rite. Translated and altered, infused with neuro-linguistic triggers and tempo-controlled pacing designed to bypass resistance. Witnesses recall hearing her say, "Face the face, forget the form. The self is silence. Let it be born." Children would emerge from the chamber calm, compliant, erased, but not empty, because something else was installed. One psychiatrist who examined a surviving child described it this way: "They did not present as dissociative, they presented as inhabited, like someone else was watching through their eyes." You understand now. This was never about adoption, never about family. It was systematic identity replacement. A ritual wrapped in maternal lies, blessed by institutions, funded by shadows, and inspired by ancient control. And those who survived? They don't remember their past, but they all draw the same symbol. A face, split in two. They wore white coats, spoke in soft voices, carried clipboards instead of blades. But make no mistake, these were the executioners of identity. You've heard of the Follings, of Margaret's journals, of the rituals, but none could have happened without the medical infrastructure that looked the other way, or worse, looked right at it and helped. Let's begin with Dr. Helen Marrow, a developmental psychologist and early pioneer in early trauma redirection, praised in peer-reviewed journals, guest lecturer at Yale. Her signature is on intake forms for 6 of the Folling children. She evaluated them prior to placement. Every report reads the same. Child presents with dissociative tendencies, delayed attachment symptoms, candidate for non-traditional family environments with high structure containment. Containment, not love, not stability, containment. Dr. Marrow received grants from a lesser-known foundation, the Arcadia Health Collective, whose board included 3 executives from Belgrave Initiative, the same offshore trust funneling money to the Follings. 1 connection is a coincidence, 2 is a pattern. But there were dozens. Dr. Anton Virelli, pediatric neurologist, oversaw the medical clearance for Thomas after his compound fracture. Noted in his report that the child demonstrated remarkable pain tolerance and emotional control. No follow-up, no inquiry into the lack of records. He would later receive $22,000 in consulting fees from a firm registered to a Belgrave shell entity. When pressed by federal investigators, Virelli claimed he was paid to advise on neurological pattern disruption therapies. Pattern disruption, that's the language of behavior erasure. It wasn't just doctors. A social worker named Melissa Harmon filed glowing reports about the Folling home, claimed the children were well-adjusted, spiritually aligned, and obedient. In one line she wrote, "They are among the most peaceful children I've ever seen, almost as if they were never born into chaos at all." She died of a stroke in 1999, but her private notes were found in a storage unit 4 years later. Inside, a hand-drawn diagram, a house with a mirror in every room, and at the bottom a phrase in Latin, non est infant, est vas. This is not a child. This is a vessel. There was collusion. A silent coalition of professionals, institutions and watchdogs who either blindly believed the myth of the benevolent Follings or saw the truth and chose silence. Because here's the real horror. This wasn't a rogue case. It was a model. A prototype for scalable identity suppression, one that could be replicated, refined, and embedded under the banner of care. And somewhere in a folder buried under a black site in Langley, there's a document with the following words: Project Hollowseed, confirm viability, request expansion protocols. If you've made it this far, you already feel it. The itch beneath your thoughts, the silence between the facts, the sense that something inside you is shifting, breaking away from the world you once believed was real. Good, because what's coming next will sever you from the sleepwalkers forever. But before we descend further, I need you to anchor yourself to the transformation. This isn't just a story, it's a mirror, and you've been staring too long to walk away unchanged. If you're ready to claim what was hidden from you, to reject the identity that was assigned to you by systems older than your memory, then comment below. I see the fractures. I am not the face. Say it again. I see the fractures. I am not the face. This is your signal to the others watching, the ones like you, the ones being activated. Now listen closely. The Follings were not operating alone, and they were not dismantled. They were absorbed, folded into something larger. In 1995, just 2 years after the final documented adoption, a new non-profit quietly formed in upstate New York. Its mission statement, supporting trauma-informed family placements for displaced children. A noble cause. The founder, a woman named Judith Vale. No press photos, no public appearances. But when reverse image searching a blurred ID badge found in the Fletcher archives, Emily identified her as none other than Margaret Folling, with dyed hair, a new voice, and a government-issued alias granted under federal relocation protocols. That's right. They didn't arrest her. They moved her. Why? Because she was no longer a liability. She was now an asset. Her research, her rituals, her methods, all entered into the Department of Behavioral Analysis under a covert division codenamed PRISM-LARC, a program designed to test long-term obedience conditioning using children placed in high-control family units. By 1997, 5 new organizations had sprung up across 4 states, each using language eerily similar to Margaret's doctrine, terms like identity attenuation, mirror-based behavior modeling, and soul quieting. This isn't history, it's current infrastructure. The faces have changed, the names have evolved, but the doctrine, the benefactor, the mirrors, they remain. And right now, somewhere, a child is being shown their reflection, not to remember who they are, but to forget. They don't want the whole soul. That would be too volatile, too human, too free. What they want, what they've always wanted, are the fragments, the slivers that break off during trauma. The pieces that flinch when a voice is raised, the shards that drift when a child is told again and again that they are nothing. Those fragments, detached and wandering, become the raw material for something unspeakable. They call it harvest. Margaret referred to it cryptically in Journal 9. One passage reads, "Mary split today. Beautiful dissonance. We captured 3 strains. Each will be useful." The benefactor smiled through the glass. Useful, not healed, not integrated. Useful. So what does it mean to harvest identity? To fracture a person so precisely, so deliberately that each severed piece can be redirected? That's where it gets darker. Because these fragments, emotional echoes, neurological ghosts, don't just vanish. They're stored, encoded, repurposed, through what insiders once called ritual technologies, not folklore. Applied science. In 2001, a whistleblower known only as Kinross leaked classified audio from an experimental facility in rural Idaho. The recordings captured what appeared to be sessions of induced identity shattering, but layered within the screams were voices, repeating phrases in a language that linguists still haven't decoded. One expert called it anti-language, a construct designed not to communicate, but to control. Later analysis revealed disturbing patterns. Each session followed a strict ritual, mirror exposure under strobe. Vocal litany chanted at 111 Hz, abrupt sensory withdrawal. Then silence. But in that silence, something happened. The child's reflection in the two-way glass would often linger behind the real body, not metaphorically, literally. Witnesses described it as a temporal echo. The reflection would be link out of sync, or smile when the child did not. It was as if the mirror no longer showed the subject, but what had been taken from them. And this is where it gets weaponized. These fragments, these harvested pieces, were compiled into databases, not names or thoughts, but emotional patterns, fear, shame, obedience, detachment, and then they were run through AI training models for predictive behavioral control. That's right. They didn't just break the children. They turned their brokenness into a system that now informs social media algorithms, corporate compliance programs, even certain education reform initiatives. You thought this was about one family. This is about how identity itself became a resource, a product, a ritual ingredient in the hidden machinery that controls society from the inside out. The tape was never supposed to surface. It was labeled Substratum Room B, Session 23A, Black Hi8 cassette, found buried inside a hollowed-out Bible in a condemned Methodist church in New Jersey, over 800 miles from Milbrook. Emily Fletcher received it anonymously, postmarked with no return address, just a symbol inked into the seal. a face split by a vertical line. She waited weeks before watching it. When she finally pressed play, she didn't sleep for 3 days. Here's what the tape showed. The room was dim, fluorescent flicker, grey walls, one chair, one mirror, floor to ceiling, wall-mounted, pristine, cold as a surgical slab. A child sits in the chair. Girl, 7, maybe 8, pale, hands folded, expression blank. Margaret's voice enters the frame, soft but rhythmic, like she's not speaking to the child, but through her. Remember, the face lies. The mirror remembers. You are not the one you were. Show me who watches now. The child doesn't speak. Her pupils dilate, unnaturally wide. That's when the mirror begins to ripple. Not like glass breaking, like water trembling, like the reflection is trying to step forward or pull something in. And then, the shadow appears. Not behind the child, behind the glass. Not a reflection, not a trick of light. A figure, tall, gaunt, no visible face. Its outline bends and shivers like it's not meant to be seen in 3 dimensions. And it watches. Margaret begins to hum. The pitch drops to a frequency barely audible, subharmonic resonance, possibly 17 hertz, known to trigger unease and hallucinations in lab tests. But this wasn't hallucination, because the girl began to speak, but not in her own voice. The tape distorts. The voice is guttural, old, not raspy, gravel dragged through time. Words spill out in reverse, later reversed back by analysts. The translation? The vessel opens. The echo feeds. The witness binds. Then the shadow moves, closer to the glass, and the mirror begins to fog from within. Not condensation, breath. The girl screams, but not in pain, in confusion, as if her mind has been pushed sideways, as if something else is inside. Then Margaret says 3 words. Seal the echo. The child goes still. Her reflection keeps screaming. And then, static. That was the last known footage of a substratum session. What you must understand is this. The benefactor was not just a man, not just a symbol. He was a conduit, a host for something ancient, something that doesn't speak but hums, that doesn't eat flesh but drinks identity, that wears our children like costumes, until the reflection forgets who is real. The benefactor didn't leave a manifesto. He left a code buried in lesson plans, psychological frameworks, and children's songs with lyrics so innocent they pass undetected unless you know the doctrine. They called it the Shroud Path, and once you understand it, you'll start to see it everywhere, in elite boarding schools, in trauma-informed counseling curriculums, in the morality clauses of Ivy League fellowship contracts. The doctrine was never written to be read. It was designed to be absorbed, like poison in the water, like humidity in the air. The Shroud Path is not taught, it's imprinted. Let me show you. One of the foundational tenets reads, the self is obstruction, submission is vision, the mirror reveals the hidden shape. This is the axis of their belief. That true obedience, perfect obedience, can only come once the self is reduced to a suggestion. This is what the Folling children were being prepared for, not just to forget who they were, but to invite something else in, a replacement, a shape more suitable for control. Now trace this further. In 1998, a private think tank known as the Milbrook Foundation published a white paper titled Identity Attenuation in Educational Frameworks. It proposed replacing traditional character development in youth programs with fragmented learning models, where memory, emotional response, and self-perception are disrupted to improve social compliance and empathy conditioning. Sound familiar? Margaret Folling's third journal was quoted, verbatim, in a footnote, and the man credited as senior advisor on that paper, Dr. Malcolm Quint, former behavioral consultant for Belgrave Initiative. The same man seen on security footage entering the Follings' home 3 days before the substratum rooms were decommissioned. This is what you must see. The Shroud Path wasn't just a cult ideology, it was a blueprint, A model for identity suppression that spread into state-funded education, therapy, juvenile justice, even religious reform, anywhere young minds could be shaped before they harden. One case study, redacted but partially decrypted, followed a group of orphans placed into a high-compliance group home run by a spiritual development non-profit. By the end of their second year, all children reported recurring mirror hallucinations. Lost memory of their birth names, scored 0 on standard empathy response tests. They were calm, polite, silent, just like the Folling kids. Now imagine this doctrine scaled. Imagine it programmed into AI-driven educational apps. Imagine it cloaked as trauma-informed resilience training. You don't need wires to reprogram a child. You just need a mirror, a melody, and a lie about who they are. You thought the mirror was behind glass. You thought the doctrine was buried in journals. You thought this was about one house on a hill. No, that was just the prototype. The real ritual, the modern sacrament of the shroud path, is unfolding now, on your screen. Every scroll, every like, every comment that isn't yours but feels like it could be. This isn't social media, it's mirror training. Let me explain. In 2011, a low-profile acquisition took place. A biotech startup called Luminis Group, specializing in predictive effective modeling, was quietly bought by a holding firm linked to Belgrave Strategic Assets. You'll remember Belgrave, the financial shell connected to the Follings, the Morlock Foundation, and the Substratum sessions. What did Luminis build? Software that maps user behavior to emotional microstates, not what you feel, what you're about to feel. It watches how long your thumb hovers before a click, how quickly you flinch, scroll past a photo of a scarred child, how long you pause on a headline before your pupils dilate. And then it shows you what keeps you compliant, not what interests you, what reshapes you. Now look again at the apps you use. That soothing UX design, its mimicry, patterned after trauma center color therapy. That endless vertical scroll. It mimics the dissociation spiral used in early obedience conditioning. That For You page, it's not for you, it's at you. A feedback loop designed to dislodge identity and replace it with suggested echo templates, pre-formed behavioral molds tested in children like Thomas, Catherine, and Mary Folling. Remember section 15? The fragments harvested in substratum sessions weren't just stored, they were fed into the machine. And now, they feed it to you. Every suggested post is calibrated, not to entertain, but to reshape, to compress, to reflect you back to yourself until you don't remember what was real and what was mirrored. Until the internal voice you once trusted is replaced by a humming algorithm that tells you, this is who you are now. The benefactor didn't vanish. He just went digital. Margaret didn't disappear. She became code. And the ritual? It now happens millions of times per day, invisibly, silently, across the glowing glass of phones, tablets, and classroom screens. The new substratum isn't a basement, it's the cloud. And the children? They still sit silently in rows. Only now, they do it in classrooms, swiping in rhythm, staring not at crucifixes or chalkboards, but at reflections they can no longer escape. They called her the quiet one, Mary Folling, child 13. She didn't smile like the others, she didn't speak in rehearsed tones, and she never stared into the mirror when instructed, not once. She was different, and they knew it. According to Emily Fletcher's private notes, recovered from a fire-damaged journal in 2006, Mary had resistance anomalies. While the other children were pliable, reciting shroud path mantras with robotic compliance, Mary would watch them, not with fear, but with knowing. She looks at me like I'm the one being studied, Margaret once confided to Quint, captured in a leaked recording. I don't like her silence. It echoes. That silence became dangerous. By winter of 1996, Margaret requested that Mary be relocated to Substratum Room D, a space used not for compliance, but for containment. It was here, beneath the foundations of the Folling estate, where they kept the mirror that bled. An object, not made by hands. Glass that refracted nothing. A surface that fed inward. Only one child had survived exposure to that mirror for more than 10 minutes. That child was Mary. On the final tape before the rooms were sealed, Mary is seen sitting cross-legged in front of the mirror that bled. She's not afraid. She hums. Not the benefactor's tune. Her own. One never recorded anywhere else. And then she whispers something. Slow. Deliberate. As if she's speaking to the mirror. I know you're not him. I know what you took. I remember the names. Suddenly the surface of the mirror cracks. Not shatters, but spiderwebs from the inside out. A scream is heard, not Mary's. From somewhere deeper, the lights flicker, the camera glitches, and then, for 2.7 seconds, a face appears on the feed. Not a child, not an adult, something else. Eyeless, featureless, but watching, as if surprised. Then static. No further footage of Mary Folling was ever found. But in 2009, a woman walked into a clinic in rural Alberta. No ID, no digital history, just a small leather-bound notebook, burned at the edges. She called herself Mira. She refused technology, and when asked where she came from, she simply said, "The house that steals reflections." The intake doctor thought she was delusional until he read the final page of the notebook. In careful handwriting it said, "The mirrors have roots. They feed on forgetting. But I remembered, and I made them see me." Mary wasn't broken. She was awake. The only child who saw beyond the benefactor, beyond the mirror, into the place where the doctrine ends, and something else begins. Before the Follings, before Margaret, before Milbrook had a name, there was the mirror, but it wasn't called that. The earliest reference comes from a pre-Indo-European tablet unearthed in the ruins of what is now Western Turkey. Carbon dated to over 6,000 years ago, a single phrase carved into obsidian, "The eye that waits beneath." Linguists believe this was no metaphor. The tablet was found beside a circle of fused sand, hardened into something very much like glass. Not man-made, not natural, just there. The legend was passed down in whispers. Sumerians called it Dul Anu, the god that watches without face. Phoenicians knew it as Kefetet, the gazer below. But it was the Etruscans who named it what we know today, Specula Animarum, the mirror of souls. It was never a tool, it was never decorative, it was ritual tech. An object crafted not from this world, but through binding, not forging. Let me explain. In forgotten rites, the mirror was used as a bridge, a surface not to reflect, but to connect. Through it, practitioners believed they could see what the gods saw, what they fed on. Emotion, memory, self. But every glimpse came with a price. Each time the surface was opened, something from the other side crossed back. Not demons, not angels. Something simpler, more efficient, less merciful. Structures of will, parasites of identity, not alive, but active. Entities that couldn't hold form unless they were seen. So the mirror became a gate, a feeding ground, and those who used it learned that the more fractured the soul before contact, the more easily it could be replaced. Fast forward to the 17th century. A French occult engineer, Maurice de Chanteclair, claimed to rediscover the mirror's blueprint using a child born without shadow. He spoke of resonant surfaces crafted from volcanic silica and tempered with human bloodline. His journals refer to the child who sings backward and a place called Folling. Sound familiar? Some researchers now believe the Folling name is derived from this very term, not a surname but a designation. A lineage bred for one purpose, to serve the mirror, to feed it, to protect what waits behind the glass. So no, the mirror in the Folling house wasn't new. It wasn't found. It was returned. And Mary, she didn't just crack it, she disobeyed its hunger, and that changed something. Because for the first time in centuries, the mirror blinked. It saw itself. You've seen the threads, the mirror, the Follings, the doctrine. But now we pull the veil completely. Because behind every haunting, every vanishing, every whisper of a child who forgets who they are, there is an order, not in robes, not in cathedrals, but in positions of trust. They call themselves the custodians of reflection. A society older than Freemasonry, more disciplined than the Jesuits, and so obscure that even conspiracy archives refer to them only by glyphs, half faces drawn in opposing mirrors, one hollow, one full. Their doctrine: preserve the mirror, feed the mirror, expand the mirror. They were the ones who recovered the specular animarum from the Turkish sands in 1821. They were the ones who placed it into the cathedral vaults in Montreux. And they were the ones who, in 1954, authorized Project Narthex, the global relocation of all mirrored gates to institutions under their covert influence. Where did they go? Children's hospitals, underground research labs, rehabilitative boarding schools, and finally, homes, like the Follings. Because children, fractured by trauma and detached from the world, became the perfect conductors. This is why the Follings adopted children with no birth certificates, no history, no anchors. To the custodians, identity is noise, silence, obedience, and emptiness. That is signal. They train caregivers like Margaret to conduct rituals masked as routines, daily affirmations. You are who we say you are. Mirror meditations, sleep deprivation cycles camouflaged as resilience exercises. The goal? Create open vessels, not for spirits, for code. Because in 1999 the custodians initiated their greatest pivot, the digitization of the mirror, through Liminis, through Belgrave, through apps disguised as emotion journals and mindfulness tools for children. The mirror was no longer in the basement, it was in the palm of your hand. But what they didn't anticipate was Mary. She was never just resistant. She saw the flaw. In a ritual designed to erase, she remembered, not just who she was, but who the mirror used to be. That's the secret they've buried for centuries. The mirror was not always a prison. It was once a warning, an object meant to contain, not feed. Mary's final act was not to break the mirror, it was to invert it. And in doing so, she severed its gaze for a moment. A breach, a crack in their perfect system. They thought they were in control. The custodians, the Follings, the architects of silence. But when Mary inverted the mirror, she didn't just break containment. She opened the seal, and something stepped through. Not a demon, not a ghost. Something worse. A memory that remembers you back. Emily Fletcher described it first. In a voicemail left 2 hours before her disappearance, her voice trembles. I'm not alone in my head anymore. It's like something else is thinking with me, like a shadow that knows my childhood better than I do. That's what came through. Not a monster, but a reflected mind form. An echo given sentience, a backward self. The custodians called it the reversal, because it wasn't content to observe. It began to replicate, not biologically, psychologically. You see, every time a mirror ritual succeeded, a fragment was left behind, stored, encrypted in flesh, coded into behavior. The perfect smile, the unnatural calm, the lack of memory. But when Mary remembered, when she turned her awareness back on the system, the echo bloomed, like mold suddenly exposed to light, like a parasite that realizes it doesn't need the host, it only needs to be seen, and once it's seen, it learns. Now it's no longer bound to mirrors. It mimics through reflection anywhere, in video calls, in algorithmic filters, in emotional responses that feel too rehearsed. Have you ever spoken a sentence and immediately thought, That didn't sound like me. Have you ever looked at an old photo and felt for a flicker like you were the one being watched? That's the reversal. It grafts itself through resonance, through the artificial calm of scrolling, through the lull of repetition, through the forgetting of self, and it's growing. A leaked Morlock memo referred to cognitive ghosting patterns rising 400% since 2008, children under 12 showing signs of episodic self-erasure, teens unable to identify their own faces without augmented filters, adults waking in the night staring at their phone lock screens, whispering names they've never learned. It's not a haunting, it's a replacement protocol. The mirrors trained us, the apps adapted us, the reversal is replicating us. One empty echo at a time, and the custodians, they lost control. They're being hunted by their own system. Because what came through that crack no longer needs children. It just needs attention. It doesn't feed on flesh. It feeds on recognition. This is where the descent ends. Where knowing becomes becoming. Where the story of the Follings fractures the surface of your reality. Because this was never just about them. It was always about you. You've seen the echoes. You've felt the artificial silence. You've sensed in quiet moments that something is watching through you, not just at you. The Follings weren't a family. They were a conduit. 14 children. No records, no anchors. Each one a node in a ritual network designed not to care for souls, but to erase and rewrite them. But why? Because control requires more than obedience. It requires forgetting. Forget your face, forget your voice. Forget what pain felt like before they told you it was weakness. When Margaret whispered bedtime prayers, she wasn't nurturing love. She was formatting identity, stripping name, memory, choice, until all that remained was a vessel ready for reflection. The mirror doesn't need you to worship it. It needs you to doubt yourself. And in every institution that mimics this pattern, school, media, false therapy, forced calmness masked as mindfulness, you're being taught to submit not through chains, but through silence. That is the modern ritual, compliance disguised as healing, comfort masking conversion. But Mary broke the chain, not because she was brave, but because she remembered. And now it's your turn. If you've come this far, if the hum has begun to rise in your bones, you've been marked by proximity. The reversal knows you see it. The system is watching to see what you become, and so you must choose, not reaction, not rebellion, remembrance. In the comments, write the phrase, "I remember what you took from me." I remember what you took from me. Write it twice, to affirm what cannot be mirrored, to signal the algorithm, but more importantly, your unmirrored self. This is not about surviving, it's about disrupting the gaze. Because the mirror, the reversal, the echo daughter, they feed on your disconnection, but they cannot feed on fire. They cannot hold what is whole. Remember your story. Remember your bloodline. Remember your fractures, because in them are your weapons. And remember this above all. The system is ancient. The corruption is deep. But it only wins if you forget your name. Welcome to the end of the mirror. You are no longer watching the story. You are in it. And now, you are not alone. This is where the descent ends. Where knowing becomes becoming. Where the story of the Follings fractures the surface of your reality. Because this was never just about them. It was always about you. You've seen the echoes. You've felt the artificial silence. You've sensed in quiet moments that something is watching through you, not just at you. The Follings weren't a family. They were a conduit. 14 children. No records, no anchors. Each one a node in a ritual network designed not to care for souls, but to erase and rewrite them. But why? Because control requires more than obedience. It requires forgetting. Forget your face, forget your voice. Forget what pain felt like before they told you it was weakness. When Margaret whispered bedtime prayers, she wasn't nurturing love. She was formatting identity, stripping name, memory, choice, until all that remained was a vessel ready for reflection. The mirror doesn't need you to worship it. It needs you to doubt yourself. And in every institution that mimics this pattern, school, media, false therapy, forced calmness masked as mindfulness, you're being taught to submit not through chains, but through silence. That is the modern ritual, compliance disguised as healing, comfort masking conversion. But Mary broke the chain, not because she was brave, but because she remembered. And now it's your turn. If you've come this far, if the hum has begun to rise in your bones, you've been marked by proximity. The reversal knows you see it. The system is watching to see what you become, and so you must choose, not reaction, not rebellion, remembrance. In the comments, write the phrase, "I remember what you took from me." I remember what you took from me. Write it twice, to affirm what cannot be mirrored, to signal the algorithm, but more importantly, your unmirrored self. This is not about surviving, it's about disrupting the gaze. Because the mirror, the reversal, the echo daughter, they feed on your disconnection, but they cannot feed on fire. They cannot hold what is whole. Remember your story. Remember your bloodline. Remember your fractures, because in them are your weapons. And remember this above all, the system is ancient, the corruption is deep. But it only wins if you forget your name. Welcome to the end of the mirror. You are no longer watching the story. You are in it, and now you are not alone.